Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. You're watching Culturally Determined, and I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade. And my guest today is someone who probably needs no introduction to the Blogging Heads fan base, but I'll ask him to introduce himself anyway. Professor Daniel Drezner.
Hi, I'm Daniel Drezner. I'm a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I also write a spoiler alerts column for the Washington Post. And normally I am the co-host of Dresberg, which is a Blogging Heads podcast that I do with Heather Hurlburt from the New America Foundation. And for those of you who've been wanting to know when the next release of Dresbert will be, there will be a live performance of Dresbert coming up at Wednesday, October 18th at 6:45 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. We have something special planned for, which is why it's live, but I don't want to explain why, and you'll just have to tune in and find out what's going on.
Yeah, so tune in for that. The reason you're on today, so you've actually, to talk about your book, The Ideas Industry.
Wait, keep it hold on it so we can both hold it up at the same time. There we go. Oh, that looks so good.
So yes, you actually have talked about this on Blogging Heads before, but a special perk for Blogging Heads hosts is they get to plug their books twice on Blogging Heads. So thanks for coming on. So people are probably, who watch Bob Wright's show, probably heard about this book before, but hopefully we'll cover a couple different things than in Bob Wright's conversation. But do you want to just give, maybe by way of introducing the book, talk about the divide between the public intellectual and the thought leader?
Right. So this book is The Ideas Industry, How Pessimists, Partisans, and Plutocrats Are Transforming the Marketplace of Ideas. And the basic premise of the book is that if you look on the supply side of those people who are trying to come up with ideas that affect the way that the public or that elite policymakers think about the world, there are two sort of styles of intellectual contribution. There are what I call public intellectuals and thought leaders. Public intellectuals most closely resemble Isaiah Berlin's foxes, which is to say they know a little bit about a lot. They usually have some degree of expertise in an issue, but they're perfectly willing to comment beyond their area of expertise. And what public intellectuals basically excel at is being critics. Public intellectuals can tell you everything that is wrong with everyone else's idea, and they're really good at it. They're basically like the world's best second-year grad students imaginable. And so that's a quality thing. Thought leaders, on the other hand, are Isaiah Berlin's hedgehogs. As Berlin put it, a fox knows a little bit about many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And so basically the hedgehog has one or two big ideas that they think can explain everything. And so in that sense, they are evangelists or proselytizers. They believe that their one big idea is the fundamental lens through which you should try to understand the way the world works. And if anyone asks them anything, they will somehow find a way to tie it into that big idea. Now, as I put it in the book, the marketplace of ideas needs both of these kinds of thinkers. You want both thought leaders and public intellectuals out there. And the problem is that if things get out of balance, if, for example, there are a lot of public intellectuals and not a lot of thought leaders, then the problem with the marketplace of ideas is that the barriers to entry are too high, in that it becomes tougher for sort of new intellectuals who have a big idea to try to break through or try to make it accessible, because public intellectuals will criticize everything to within an inch of their lives. And so as a result, nothing new really gets entertained. And as a result, the marketplace ideas get stagnant or ossified. And that's not necessarily good, because we constantly need new notions because the world keeps changing. On the other hand, if there are very many thought leaders but not enough public intellectuals, then the barriers to exit are too high, which is to say that it becomes much easier for anyone to introduce or inject a new idea into the marketplace of ideas. That's the good thing. The problem is that there aren't enough public intellectuals to stress test those ideas. And so as a result, stupid ideas don't die. They just persist. And indeed, the longer they stay in the marketplace of ideas, the more legitimacy they might actually acquire. And so in that sense, the problem is that there isn't the proper pruning of those ideas. And basically, the book is how, over the last 40 years or so, there have been a number of sort of structural factors that have essentially stacked the deck in favor of thought leaders at the expense of public intellectuals. So, although the book seems like I'm probably being more critical of thought leaders than I am of public intellectuals, I wouldn't think that I was intending to do that. All I was trying to point out is that the balance of power right now is askew, and I would like it to be recentered.
Mm-hmm. So your first chapter is called "Do Ideas Even Matter?" And one of the things that I assume you mostly wrote this book before Donald Trump was elected president.
Yes, yes. The bulk of the book was written during the campaign.
It seems, you take this up as your initial chapter. I'm wondering whether there's the way the Trump presidency came to be and has played out has changed your mind at all about whether ideas matter or whether this is kind of like a meaningless universe in which we all function.
Right. So it was interesting writing this book because I started writing right around the time that Trump announced his candidacy. And the book, I started in the summer of 2015 and then wrapped up in the fall of 2016. So I would say two things about the, sort of Trump's effect on the book. The first is that I had one last crack at the text after the election. So I specifically wrote it in such a way that I knew that I was going to have to make changes depending upon who won the presidential election. And what terrified me after the fact was that Trump winning made editing that book much easier. That in some ways, the arguments I was making in the book were saying that Trump was going to win. It just never occurred to me that it would apply to that. Mm-hmm. Because I was basically saying that in the sort of current environment we have, one in which there's a remarkably low level of trust and authority and expertise, in which political polarization is at an all-time high, and one in which plutocrats exercise enormous power over the way we the way we fund or think about ideas, it stacks the deck in favor of sort of thought leaders, regardless of their quality of their thoughts, as opposed to public intellectuals. And if you want to look at the two candidates, there is no denying that sort of Hillary Clinton was the ultimate technocrat. One of the valid criticisms, I think, of her campaign was that she didn't have any big ideas.
Right.
And indeed there were studies showing that, like, in terms of her ads and so on and so forth, there was remarkably little content in terms of ideas that she wanted to put forward. Not that she didn't have ideas. She clearly had 10-point plan after 10-point plan after 10-point plan, but nothing that was necessarily inspiring in that sense. Donald Trump, on the other hand, as I wrote in the book, is the brassiest thought leader in existence, which is to say he came up with all these ideas that most experts would deride as idiotic, but nonetheless, he claimed as his own. The notion of building a wall along the southern border, the notion that the key to making America great again is protectionism, the idea that we should have a ban on travel from various Muslim countries. Mm-hmm. These were ideas that were all beyond the pale in some ways. And to give Trump some credit, and this was pointed out, there are people like Zeynep Tufekci and Mike Consul who made this point that say what you will about the quality of Trump's ideas, we can perfectly debate that. There were things that he actually did. There were issues that he brought up that would not have been brought up otherwise. And he's correct about that. Immigration is an issue, actually, on substantive merits, was not that big of a deal. At the time, immigration had been dying, or illegal immigration had been on the decline ever since the 2008 financial crisis. Nonetheless, he, was a way in which he sort of promoted it. So, in that sense, the election was consistent with what I was arguing. Now, Trump's administration going forward, this has actually been the fascinating thing. So, to address your question of do ideas even matter, I think actually the Trump administration's performance to date has been conclusive evidence that it turns out that ideas matter, mm-hmm. and that as it turns out, the more divorced you get from quality intellectuals, the deeper in trouble you are going to be. Which is to say, weirdly, I think Donald Trump might make public intellectuals great again. If you think about it, coming into office, he had very tenuous connections to the sort of Republican intelligentsia, as it were. I mean, there was one think tank, the Heritage Foundation, that sort of was on good terms with him. You saw the creation of this new journal called American Affairs, which was clearly designed to be a more populist journal. And that's a good thing, I would argue. You want, if you're going to have a president, trying to put these ideas forward, you want people to actually try to put flesh to the bone, as it were. What is striking to me, though, is that over the first 9 months now of the administration's time in office, they keep losing on these intellectual debates. That Heritage has become more divorced. Jim DeMint, among others, who I talked about in the book, got fired as the president of Heritage Foundation. And the publisher of American Affairs has basically disavowed Donald Trump,
right,
saying that he doesn't stand for I don't know what he's for anymore. And on policy issue after policy issue, whether it's healthcare or tax reform, or for that matter, dealing with North Korea, what is striking to me, or the transgender ban, what is striking to me is how bereft this administration is of any kind of policy content whatsoever, which I find fascinating.
Right. So and you draw a parallel, or you compare Obama in the book as being more of a public intellectual, and he kind of as a self-styled intellectual. Trump as a thought leader, but maybe Trump is a thought leader who doesn't actually have a thought, or the only thought is Trump himself.
Yeah.
So there's like the emperor has no clothes.
I think that's part of it. But the other thing is, beyond that, Trump, presumably every new White House has an opportunity to bring in people that might at least share the ideas that you've articulated. And you could argue to some extent Trump did that. He appointed Jeff Sessions as the Attorney General. Is it Jason Miller? I can't remember. Jason or Justin Miller? I'm forgetting the name.
Yeah, the top aide.
The Sessions aide who's now in the White House. Steve Bannon, clearly to some extent. Sebastian Gorka.
Yeah, I mean, you're laughing as you name these people. I mean, it is striking. Almost every conservative intellectual lined up against Trump during the primary, and it was like a failure of the marketplace of ideas that Trump was able to win the nomination.
I think that's a fair. I don't know if that's. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair statement. But I would argue that that his performance as president is also evidence that it turns out ideas matter somewhat. Mm-hmm. Which is to say that it's not just that he's doing bad in terms of on policy terms. He's also doing bad politically. There are a few areas where he's been able to get what he wants in terms of things like appointing judges, to some extent deregulation. But those weren't even necessarily his most powerful ideas. Those are things he actually outsourced to the sort of traditional GOP establishment. So it's not surprising that those are the areas where he's actually made the greatest progress. But beyond that, it seems increasingly clear, you're right, that it's not just that he's, that his big ideas, it turns out, lack any kind of way in which they can be implemented. He can't rely on any kind of mandarins to help him convert that into a practicable set of policies. And not surprisingly, he's getting hammered for that.
Yeah, I mean, the way I've looked at Trump has been like he's non-ideological, which is very unusual in American politics. And he has certain core like kind of instincts, like he wants to be seen as tough, and he wants people to pay attention to him, but he doesn't have like the kind of he doesn't have an ideology like he used to be a Democrat. He was a independent Republican, renegade Republican.
So this is where I would push back a little bit. I think there are elements of there's no denying that Trump, and there are a whole vast array of issues where Trump has no fixed core beliefs. I'm perfectly willing to concede that. But there are a few big areas where Trump has been relatively consistent over time. And this is something else I pointed out in the book. On foreign economic policy, for example, Trump is clearly a mercantilist. And he's been so since the late 80s. So, trade or any kind of economic exchange to him is a zero-sum game. And that's been clear ever since he took out that big ad about Japan in the New York Times in the late 80s. And so he's actually been remarkably consistent on that point. And on foreign policy, I would say he has been consistent, not so much in terms of sort of grand strategy, but in terms of negotiating style. Because it's the art of the deal as far as he's concerned. He really thinks that these kinds of blustery negotiation techniques in which you make constant threats or engage in truthful hyperbole, it is part of his personal style. And I think he thinks that's how government should negotiate with each other. Now, I think both of these ideas are catastrophic across a wide array of areas. What is fascinating to me is how ineptly he's tried to execute both of them. And that's the part of the story that I mean, one of the things that I've stressed, I think, in my writing, not just the book, or not in the book, but at the Post, is how remarkably weak Trump is as a president. Right. That, the presidencies wax and wane in power. Partially it's a function of whether their party controls the, Congress. It's what the courts will do. It's whether their own party is unified or not. But, ordinarily most presidents at a minimum are actually able to command their executive branch to do what they want them to do. And what is striking to me is that, even though the Republicans control the House, the Senate, to some extent the court, however you want to look at that, what's surprising to me genuinely is how little he's managed to accomplish, both in terms of getting, anything through Congress, but frequently asking his cabinet officers to do things and they're reluctant to do them, or having to actually flatly contradict publicly the cabinet in order to get what he wants. Which is not to say he's not getting anything. He's obviously accomplishing some things. But it is remarkable how little he's accomplishing compared to the sort of garden variety president.
Yeah, I mean, considering that the Republicans do control Congress and do have a functional majority on the Supreme Court, and he won a big electoral college victory, as he likes to brag.
Yes.
What are the big policy victories? Are like the travel ban, maybe, and really, and like
the Gorsuch appointment.
Yeah, that's true. Gorsuch does kind of stand aside.
Yeah.
Would you see a connection between Trump and Obama in that they both kind of, Obama, he famously didn't have a doctrine, and leading from behind and don't do stupid stuff became the taglines for the Obama doctrine. But I mean, I feel like there's no Trump doctrine just because he hasn't thought enough about it or doesn't care enough about foreign policy to have a consistent doctrine. And it's more like there's some people who kiss his ass, like the president of Turkey or something, and then he's friendlier to them, and then someone else is kind of rude to him, so he just goes off of these weird personal relationships.
Well, so if there is a commonality between Obama and Trump, and there's obviously many differences, but the commonality is the disdain and even contempt, potentially, that both these presidents held towards what you would consider the foreign policy establishment in Washington. So if you go back to Obama, Ben Rhodes very famously gave this interview in the New York Times Magazine where he derided the sort of, think tank community and assembled, foreign policy cognoscenti as, quote, the Blob, which was fascinating because until Rhodes went to the White House, he had almost no foreign policy experience whatsoever. Obama himself in the long Atlantic interview that he gave to Jeff Goldberg articulated a similar kind of frustration with, as he put it, not playing by the traditional foreign policy playbook. And similarly, Trump in the one sort of, big foreign policy speech he gave during the campaign talked about the need to shake the rust off the sort of American foreign policy, that it was being run by people who didn't know what they were doing. If there was a difference between the two on this, the difference is that Obama, while he clearly disagreed with these people, was also perfectly willing to debate them. He would have, people like Tom Friedman or Fareed Zakaria come to the White House to, in some ways have a conversation with them about foreign policy and to sort of bounce ideas off them. Not that they functioned as advisors, but more that I think he enjoyed the debate. Mm-hmm. Trump clearly, does not enjoy doing that at all. What he enjoys is putting people down. So in that sense, they share the disdain, or they share the disagreement with the Blob. The difference is the way in which they react to it, which is, I think Obama recognized that there was a cost to disagreeing with this community. I think Trump doesn't care about it, even though I also think Trump incurs great cost from doing that as well.
I wonder if because of the idiosyncrasies of Trump, the most powerful intellectual outlet in the country right now is the TV show Fox and Friends, because he watches every day, and a story will come on, and 20 minutes later he's tweeting about it. And right. The fact that a fluffy morning show has attained this power is absurd. But there is kind of this weird, bizarre pipeline between Fox News and Trump that has never existed before in this way.
So I would say a few things on this. First, I don't think it's unique to Fox and Friends. Trump clearly watches way more TV than Obama did, or Bush did, or probably any president going back to Lyndon Johnson. And so, he doesn't only react to Fox and Friends. He reacts to Morning Joe. He reacts to CNN. That's actually my favorite part about this, is that Trump claims he doesn't watch that much television, or that he doesn't, He doesn't like it when people say he does this, and he claims he only watches Fox and Friends.
Well, a great detail is that he apparently TiVos the morning shows and watches them later in the day. Like these shows that are made for you to like watch 10 minutes of it while you're eating your breakfast. He saves it up and watches it later on.
I think he clearly, I mean, in the case of Fox, I think Fox and Friends he actually watched. I mean, he might TiVo it at times, but if you look at when the tweets come out, there are times where he's clearly watching it live.
Yeah.
But that said, here you have to wonder, well, when does this, does this actually matter? To say that there are times where he's going to tweet something out based on a story he watches on Fox and Friends, and the tweet itself might generate a news peg or two, but it winds up not amounting to much in the end. And indeed, the real problem that Trump has with his Twitter feed, is that for all the fears that people had that he was just going to use it to distract people from, to pay attention to the shiny object over here while he's doing everything over here and actually accomplishing stuff, I would say it's what it turns out is two things that are very different. The first is he's using the Twitter object here to distract people from the clusterfucks that are happening over here, not actual policy accomplishments, but real disasters like, Puerto Rico or his Secretary of State calling him a fucking moron or these kinds of things. So that's thing one. Thing two is that the problem with Trump now is that his tweets, as threats wind up being, because they're never acted upon, because he will make these outrageous threats or warnings, and then there's no follow through. People are beginning to not listen to him. At least, his base cares about it. I suppose. I'm sure they like the gestures, but in terms of foreign policy, this is disastrous. The last thing you want is, with the exception of North Korea, where I am somewhat glad that North Korea is not taking Trump's tweets seriously, but everywhere else, you want the president's word to be his bond. You actually want him to have some credibility in terms of conducting foreign affairs. As I've been saying repeatedly, the president has become simultaneously more predictable and less credible online.
Right, and one of your running Twitter threads is, I'll paraphrase, I'll start treating the president like an adult when people start talking about him like an adult. You catalog, mostly anonymous news accounts of him, fuming in private and sulking and acting like a toddler.
Getting 2 dishes of ice cream, that was my personal favorite.
I mean, you can't, like, if you made this stuff up, no one would believe it.
It was the ice cream was the one where it's like, this is going to go on for a long time.
How do you think that is playing internationally? How are other foreign leaders, do they view this guy just as a sideshow at this point, or what? How is this playing internationally?
Oh no, I think they take Trump seriously. The way this is playing internationally, which is more problematic, is that they don't know who else in the U.S. administration they can trust. And by this, I want to be clear. I'm not saying that they think someone like Rex Tillerson, for example, is lying. They just don't know if these people have the juice to actually influence policy. So, when Rex Tillerson says we're going to side with, going back to the Gulf Cooperation Council sanctions on Qatar, where Tillerson makes it pretty clear early on that the GCC has to back off, Trump takes the exact opposite position. And, we saw it more recently on North Korea. And, I've been arguing Rex Tillerson has been incompetent for quite some time, but I do have some degree of sympathy for him at this point, because at this point, regardless of whether you think whatever you think of his competence, if you are a foreign leader, why would you ever trust anything that Rex Tillerson tells you as representing the position of the U.S. government? Because all you have to do is wait for Trump to articulate something different. On the other hand, I think that foreign leaders, will listen to Trump, will not take Trump's bombast as seriously as they did before. And I think you've seen this evolve over time to where, it's not like they're thrilled with him, but, they'll let him bloviate and it's not really going to matter all that much. They will look for changes in actual policies rather than just his rhetoric. And then, the only other, I think, foreign policy principle that has any kind of influence or has retained any kind of influence globally is probably Jim Mattis. And that's because Mattis actually has command over significant resources. So if he disagrees with Trump or if he wants to do something, he can actually do it and not worry about blowback from the White House. So, for example, on Gutter, it was clear Mattis thought that Mattis has genuine reasons for not wanting to alienate Gutter because we have a large Air Force base there and so on and so forth. And I don't think it was a coincidence that the DoD announced a major arms sale to Gutter after the GCC had imposed its embargo. And similarly, Mattis's comments on the Iran deal about how it's in our interest to stay in the Iran deal, clearly send a signal about the degree to which the administration is divided on that topic.
So in the book, you talk a lot about how the brand of the public intellectual or thought leader is something that needs to be cultivated in the modern era. And you did a survey of other public intellectuals and came up with a list of the top 15. This is in terms of foreign policy. And when I'll just read off the beginning of the list. So you have in the first slot, you have Henry Kissinger, then Tom Friedman, Fareed Zakaria, Bob Kagan, Joseph Nye, Charles Krauthammer, Walter Russell Mead, David Ignatius, Francis Fukuyama, and Robert Kaplan. So when I read this list, I was thinking like a lot of these people have become like either jokes or, in the case of like Kissinger, like universally despised by at least, okay, universally despised is an overstatement. But I do know someone who told me recently that she's planning on taking the day off and celebrating at a bar when Kissinger finally dies, because she holds him in such low esteem.
Okay.
And then Friedman is certainly influential, but I mean, he often becomes a parody of himself. Zakaria had a plagiarism scandal embroil him the past couple of years. Mm-hmm. I mean, Fukuyama's The End of History has been, I think a lot of people have been saying that he got this entirely wrong. I mean, is this just like the risk of being a powerful intellectual is that people are going to despise you for your ideas, or some subset of people are going to hate you, or is there something wrong with how you become a high-ranking intellectual?
I mean, so yeah, these are all issues. I mean, I think I put the sentence in the book, but I mean, the problem with being a successful foreign policy intellectual is that essentially your audience treats you almost like an indie rock band, which is to say they always like your early work. So, I mean, Tom Friedman 20 years ago, 30 years ago was thought of as a relatively savvy foreign affairs columnist. And his first book, From Beirut to Jerusalem, was very favorably reviewed. And even people who mock his later work will generally talk about how that work stands up. I would argue the same is true of Fareed Zakaria. His first book, which was an extension of his dissertation, From Wealth to Power, I still occasionally teach from. It's a good book. And most of the names you say, I would push back on Fukuyama. Fukuyama is a special case. But the point being that, yeah, as you move up, as you become a superstar, one of the things I'm basically arguing in the book is that the world of intellectuals is now resembling the world of either entertainment or sports, which is to say that essentially you now have superstars at the top that command a disproportionate share of the overall market that's going on here. And the effect of that on intellectuals is not just that you become a brand, but the other problem is that you basically force intellectuals to be the one thing they really suck at, which is to be managers. Suddenly they are no longer just writing a single column. They are writing a column and hosting a television show, or they're not just hosting a television show and writing a column, they're also trying to write a book, or they are trying to make a documentary based on the book. There's about 5 or 6, or they're giving 2 or 3 paid lectures a month, to help supplement their income. There are way too many things that they are asked to do. And as a result, if corners don't get cut, they get rounded somewhat. And so sloppiness starts to kick in. But I think the other thing that kicks in, as you say, is that, the moment you become a superstar, you also become a big fat target for all the rest of the intellectual firmament. And essentially the effect this has, I think, on other intellectuals is it sort of polarizes them. There are either people who will wind up becoming fawning acolytes for these people, hoping that by riding their coattails they can, do some things on their own. Or more likely, there are people who wind up getting infuriated because they believe that these people have reached a level of success far exceeding whatever their actual intellectual abilities are. but the effect of this on the intellectuals themselves is that they wind up basically developing a mental callus where they learn how to tune out criticism. And I would argue that I'm not a huge fan of slippery slope arguments, but I think this is one time where I think the slippery slope does matter, because the first kinds of criticisms you will get as someone who is not at the superstar level, but is at sort of upper middle class status on this hierarchy. You start attracting criticism the more success you get, which is great. That's as it should be. But the sort of first criticism comes in the form of anonymous trolls online, and it becomes ridiculously easy to tune that kind of thing out. And then it will often come from people who accuse you of being a partisan hack on one side or the other. And that also becomes relatively easy to tune out. And it becomes an easier thing to tune out more and more criticism, to the point where I think sometimes these people will tune out criticism because they assume the criticism is born out of jealousy. That they are succeeding as opposed to the critic who is not. And as a result, you wind up tuning out even valid criticisms. And so there's no check on your thoughts, on your thought process. You wind up getting fat and happy and lazy, and it causes you to produce less than spectacular or less than stellar output, and no one's going to tell you otherwise. Or no one's going to tell you otherwise that you would listen to. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I'd be interested in your personal perspective on this, especially when it comes to Twitter and other online media. I mean, the main thing that Twitter seems to be useful for is kind of forming a side and then ganging up on someone who's on the other side, or expressing disdain for someone on the other side. How, the thinkers who are coming up within the social media era, is it just that they're tuning out the criticism because they think it's just trolling, or how do you think this will shape kind of the future of the ideas industry?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, there's a couple of possible different effects. One is that some of these people will simply disdain social media from the outset. Someone like Ta-Nehisi Coates, for example, is on Twitter, but he's not terribly active, and I think he consciously restricts the amount of his time on the medium, which is probably good for his sanity, and also a way in which he can develop deeper thoughts.
Right.
But it does mean that
he also used, I don't know if he still does this, but he used to have a very active comment community on his blog that he would engage with.
And I talk about this in the book, that was an example of where he was genuinely trying to foster a real conversation in terms of his comments. But in some ways, this story is a tragedy, because as he became more and more successful, unsurprisingly, his blog at The Atlantic started attracting more and more commenters, which meant that it became that much more difficult to referee or moderate the comments. And eventually they gave up, I believe. It just became too taxing for everyone involved. And so I don't blame him for turning off this kind of this source of criticism. But again, you're turning off something where probably 95% of it is not going to be terribly valid, but it means you do miss the 5% of valid comments that might be worth listening to. But it's mentally exhausting to try to filter those out. The other effect might be on more, ambitious folks who want to reach superstar status as a public intellectual, is that it does give them an incentive to find some way to go viral with an argument. And in some ways, that's where social media does do things that maybe other forms of media do not. Which is, say, if you can actually manage to write something that is provocative and exercises people, and that goes viral, that's one way you can get your name. You can elevate your status and move up the intellectual food chain. But the problem with that, as I say in the book, is that you have intellectual superstars that wind up craving being a superstar far more than they crave being an intellectual. And so they probably, in some ways, there are two problems with that strategy. The first is that you will fail, but the second is that you will succeed too early, before you have actually earned your intellectual bona fides. So, in the book I talk about, I compare and contrast Fareed Zakaria and Neil Ferguson as certain kinds of intellectual styles. And, you could say what you will about both of these guys, but there is no denying that before they became superstars, they actually had a bedrock of quality work. They both got PhDs. They both wrote very, very good first and second books. They both toiled for a long period of time writing other essays before they sort of, broke through, as it were. Now, you can question the choices they've made now, but they're doing that on the basis of a significant stock of intellectual capital. On the other hand, someone who's 25 and cracks through might not have the same degree of gravitas and might not be able to sort of sustain themselves.
Something really interesting that you note is, an upside of the online world is the ability to discuss things that could never be discussed before. And you talk about this website called Political Science Rumors. Could you explain what that is and how it has these weird beneficial effects, even though it's mostly negative?
Well, all right, let's not exaggerate the weird beneficial effects, but yeah. So PSR is called Political Science Rumors. It was originally developed as a job rumors website, which is to say academic job markets are highly routinized. In that usually in the fall there are advertisements for jobs, and then people apply, and then there's a short list, and then there's a decision that is made. But one of the problems with this phenomenon was that very often information was very local. That if you applied, you didn't necessarily know had the short list been reached yet or not, and had they made a decision or something like that. And so the idea of rumor mill sites like these was that this would allow people to sort of anonymously post, "Hey, I'm at the hiring institution, so I can tell you this is the short list and this is who we've decided on," and so on and so forth. So that, in theory at least, was the salutary purpose of these kinds of rumor sites. Now, what has actually happened is that PSR wound up crowding out a whole variety of other more useful rumor mill sites, mostly because the PSR site is far nastier, which is to say that if someone gets hired, very often you have the commenters, speculating wildly about why that's the case. And the comments are just awful. They're, misogynist. They're often racist. Any woman who gets hired, clearly it's because she must have slept with someone on the committee, or any guy who got hired, it's because he was brown-nosing someone or something like that. Often the rumors are not true. And basically, I describe it as the online poli-sci equivalent of the Burn book from Mean Girls, which is to say that there's a lot of low-quality stuff that's written, and it's generally designed to incite rather than inform. And part of this is the anonymous nature of the website. Very few people post under their own name. That said, a couple of years ago, when a UCLA graduate student named Michael LaCour became the belle of the ball on the academic job market by doing some experimental research that got him, among other things, a potential job at Princeton. PSR was the first place where someone pointed out that maybe something was a little dodgy about the process by which these experiments were run. And eventually it came out that he had fabricated the data, that he had made up the data that had been the sort of key surprising result of his dissertation. And I, along with everyone else who despised PSR, in the week that followed that, or in the weeks that followed that, PSR became the focal point in which people were talking about it. And it was a fascinating set of conversations, and you would read thread after thread after thread. And so in that sense, it was very useful. I think it's managed to, since then it's gotten even worse than it was before that. The real question to ask, in some ways, one of the things I was wrestling with with this book was the notion that John Stuart Mill talks about with respect to the way in which discourse should go forward. And one of the things Mill could not stand was the concept of dead dogma, the concept of something that became accepted as consensus as an idea. And the thing that and so he challenged that. He argued that, no, we should always question everything. And I think that's certainly a valuable opinion. But one of the things that I wonder what Mill would think about now is that the problem is that sites like PSR are such areas of toxicity and constant questioning of even sort of bedrock assumptions that you wind up devoting a disproportionate share of your time trying to resettle debates that you thought had been settled. And the opportunity costs of that are enormous. It means you can't necessarily argue about new things. And so I think Mill underestimated the cost of revivifying dogma, as it were.
Do you think that do you think TED Talks have been a good thing or a bad thing for the marketplace of ideas?
So I think I say in the conclusion that the marketplace of ideas has changed, and it's not that it's worse than it was before. It's just bad in a different way. And I think that is how I would describe TED Talks, which is to say I do feel, and I remember being asked to comment on this, and I'm genuinely in some ways surprised by some of the vitriol that some intellectuals addressed, targeted TED Talks, because God knows they're flawed, and I certainly get that. But it really seems churlish of us as intellectuals to think, how dare there be this website and venue where ordinary plebeians can, access these 20-minute talks that are really well delivered and might actually present an idea that is genuinely interesting. I'm like, come on. I mean, we shouldn't be upset about that. Now, that said, my objection to TED Talks is always that TED Talks are clearly a venue perfectly set for thought leaders as opposed to public intellectuals. Because what thought leaders do as a general rule is to say, everything you thought about this topic is wrong. I am going to give you a different way to think about this topic. And once you think about this topic this way, suddenly your whole worldview will change, and maybe we can make a difference. And then in a TED Talk, you do that, it ends with a standing ovation, and that's it. Public intellectual, very often, if they were asked to give a TED Talk, would probably not do as well, because they will wind up coming out and saying, the world is a complex place. And any simple idea that I can tell you in 20 minutes is probably not going to be completely accurate. So if live it this way, if I'm ever, I've given TEDx talks and so on and so forth, but if I'm ever asked to give a real TED Talk based on this book, my demand would be, fine, I will give the TED Talk for 15 minutes. And then I want someone who disagrees with me to act as the discussant for 5 minutes to articulate the things that I might have gotten wrong. So I don't want to get rid of TED Talks. I think they are in terms of the media, they are a great way of communicating ideas. I want TED Talks with discussants. I want TED Talks with someone who will say, you know what, this is what I like about it, this is what I don't like about it.
Yeah, and the format itself is almost like, this is what you need to know, and that's it. And click on the next one, and
right.
you'll learn something else, and that'll be all you need to know about that. I think that's about all the questions I have.
Right.
The ideas industry, how pessimists, partisans, and plutocrats are transforming the marketplace of ideas. Available. The link will be below if you haven't picked it up yet. Highly encouraged that you do so. Dan, thanks for coming on. Thanks to all of our listeners and viewers out there. You can subscribe to this show on iTunes. You can rate it in iTunes. You can tell your friends about it if you have any friends, which maybe you don't if you're watching this.
Or talk about it on Poli-Sci Rumors. There's a lot of things you can do with it.
Yeah, or you can sound off in the comments below. Dan, thanks again for coming on.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Okay, talk to you later.